Well, let me make a couple points about what the gentleman had to say. First of all, when he talked about the battlefield, he focused on logistics. And of course, logistics is enormously important. But I would note that the number of soldiers and the quality of soldiers that are engaged in the fight matters enormously, especially in a war of attrition. Because although territory matters, as he said, it's really the casualty exchange ratio that matters the most. And there, the size of your military and more generally, the size of your population really matters. Now, you want to remember that Russia has a population advantage somewhere between 4 to 5 to 1. Just think about that, more than 4 to 1 advantage in population size. And I would guess at this point in time, I've looked at this a bit. It's hard to come up with really hard numbers, but it looks to me like up on the front lines, the Russians have somewhere on the order of a 3 to 1 advantage in terms of manpower. And then when you hear that the Minister of Defense in Ukraine says that Ukraine has a huge problem with draft dodgers, the number he uses is 2 million. 2 million draft dodgers, and they have a huge AWOL problem. This is people up on the front lines deserting to the rear. And there they estimate the number is 200,000. When you hear those numbers of draft dodgers and you hear those numbers for AWOL soldiers, and then you think about the fact that the Ukrainians are outnumbered, even if I'm wrong and it's not 3 to 1, it's 2 to 1, still 2 to 1 matters greatly. And then when you throw in the AWOL problem, the draft dodging problem, you see that just in terms of manpower up on the front line, the Ukrainians are really in deep trouble. Now, to take this a step further, there's no question that Russia has a formidable industrial base. But the fact is, not only does Ukraine not have a formidable industrial base that can pump out weapons, the Europeans and the United States do not have formidable industrial bases that can produce lots of weaponries that can match what the Russians, and by the way, I would add the Chinese, can do. So this is one of the reasons that the Ukrainian forces have been outnumbered, not only in terms of manpower, but in terms of weaponry throughout much of the war. It's a huge problem.
And John, what is your understanding of that? You talked about several different kinds of ratios. What about, because you have to pierce through the fog of in mis and disinformation of the casualty exchange ratios, because those on the Russian side say it's like 8 or 10 to 1 against the Ukraine side, and the Ukraine side says literally the exact opposite. Do you have any sense for what the real number is?
I'd guess that the casualty ratio is about 2 to 1. If I had to guess, I'd guess that probably about 350,000 Russian soldiers have died and 700 plus thousand Ukrainians have died. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainian number is even larger.
So if you take together the other numbers you talked about the manpower capabilities that Russia has, about the AWOL numbers that they have, and then the casualty exchange ratio in to the detriment of the Ukraine side, I mean, this just can't be sustained. Even forget about the logistics for the moment.
Yeah, let's just say a word about the casualty exchange ratio. I think the discourse on it in the West is ludicrous. First of all, there's no way in a war that heavily emphasizes artillery, where the Russians have had for most of the war somewhere between a 5 to 1 and a 10 to 1 advantage, that the Russians are going to be suffering much greater casualties than the Ukrainians. It just makes no sense at all. You could argue, I think, that the drones have evened things out a bit, and I think that's true. But nevertheless, artillery still matters enormously, and it certainly mattered greatly in the first few years of the war. And that has to mean that the Ukrainians suffered more deaths or more casualties than the Russians did. Furthermore, when you look at these exchanges of bodies where the Ukrainians and the Russians exchange KIAs, killed in action soldiers, they overwhelmingly favor the Ukrainians, which is to say, many more dead Ukrainians are returned by the Russians than the reverse. And that just tells you that many more Ukrainians are dying. So I would bet a good chunk of money that we will see that the Ukrainians will, in the end, have suffered many more casualties, and in particular, many more deaths than.
So when you talk about all that stuff on the tactical level, and then we zoom back out to the operational level, especially with these missiles, you see here just 2 nights ago, none of the Russian missiles were intercepted. I have doubts about how many were even before this, but then the Ukraine side actually admitted none were intercepted here. And then there was some pretty dramatic footage even overnight again that the Ukraine, the Kiev, I mean, you can see these shots here. Nothing is even going up. There's not even any attempts to intercept these. So they are basically just helpless. And this is in the capital of Kiev. We can imagine in the operational sectors in the front line where these strikes are also going on. They just don't have the video here. What does that tell you about where the war is going?
Well, let's just elevate the discussion just a bit, Danny. You're talking about Russian ballistic missiles here. The Russians hit the Ukrainians with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and furthermore, they have a huge inventory of smart bombs, independent of these ballistic missiles and drones, a huge inventory of smart bombs that they're using very effectively up on the front lines and even in the rear areas of the Ukrainian forces. Now, let's look at the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have hardly any ballistic missiles, hardly any cruise missiles, and hardly any smart bombs that they're using against the Russians. The Ukrainians rely almost exclusively these days on drones to hit Russia. So again, just think about it. The Russians have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, smart bombs, and drones, and the Ukrainians basically have drones. So what you see when you think about the air war is that there is a massive imbalance in the capabilities of the two sides. To add to that, there is no question that the Russians have done a huge amount of damage inside of Ukraine. With all that weaponry that they have, that's hardly surprising. But you've seen no evidence that the Ukrainians have been willing to throw up their hands and surrender. So why does anybody think that hitting Russia with drones alone is going to cause the Russians to throw up their hands and surrender? I just don't understand what the logic is there. This war is going to be settled on the battlefield, as you and I have talked about before. Now, logistics does matter. And let's go back to the logistics point. And there, if you look at what the Russians are doing with all that air power that I described, they're tearing apart the transportation network. They're going after gas stations in eastern Ukraine. And furthermore, they have basically shut down Ukraine's ports on the Black Sea. And most importantly, this is the Odessa ports. And that means that Ukraine is basically a landlocked country at this point in time. This is going to have devastating economic consequences. Plus, it's now very difficult for Ukraine to import weaponry into the country via the Black Sea, via the Odessa ports. And furthermore, those weapons that do get in have to travel across rail networks and road networks that the Russians are consistently targeting with all of those air assets that they have. So you can see that independent of what's going on right up on the front lines, if you look at the overall logistical picture, it looks bleak from a Ukrainian point of view.
And yet we see that Ukraine is doing stuff like this. Everybody's probably heard by now these just really dramatic video of a Ukrainian drone crashing into a beach. It was actually a couple of those. They have assassinated some the son-in-law of one of the Air Force commanders for the Russian side in Moscow. They attempted to assassinate a drone manufacturer in Moscow. Yeah, there's that one that's just, I mean, that killed a bunch of kids as well. So these obviously have nothing to do with ending the war. But do you see these kinds of strikes, especially this one here on the beaches, as just a way to say, hey, this is like a desperation act. I'm just going to make sure you get pain and punishment? Or is it part of something that someone has some idea somewhere that could negatively impact Russian public opinion against the war?
Well, as you and I both know, the end result of attacks like that is to cause a rally around the flag effect. It's going to enrage people in Russia. When you have innocent civilians on the beach enjoying a vacation and you target and kill them, that's not going to make the average Russian happy. It's going to enrage the average Russian. And again, you'll get a rally around the flag attack effect. So I don't know what the Ukrainians are thinking when they do things like this. One could argue it represents desperation. I mean, a lot of people in the West like to make the argument that this Ukrainian drone campaign is having a tremendous effect, a tremendous negative effect inside of Russia. It's a war-winning weapon of sorts. This is not a serious argument. Again, look at the extent to which the Russians have pounded Ukraine from the air with drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and smart bombs since the start of this war. And the Ukrainians have not thrown up their hands and surrendered. Don't expect the Russians to do it with these minor attacks.
And we certainly haven't seen any evidence of that. In fact, we have seen evidence of what you said about the anger that is created on the Russian side. And here of late, there has been a couple of announcements there where Putin said, hey, I have replaced 2 of my frontline commanders along the Eastern Front. And it doesn't appear to have been a demotion so much as a promotion for one of them into a logistics situation, which many are interpreting as the Russians are about ready to, or getting ready to, perhaps in the fall, to launch a new ground offensive, perhaps bigger than they have in the last 3 years. What do you know about that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know much about it, Danny, but what I have been paying attention to is what's going on the Ukrainian side. And there, as we all know, Zelensky fired his defense minister, and he fired the commanding general, General Syrskyi. I think that Syrskyi actually was doing an excellent job given the limits of his position. He was outnumbered by the Russians in all sorts of ways. He had huge problems raising Ukrainian manpower, getting them trained and getting them up to the front lines. He had a huge problem with soldiers being AWOL and so forth and so on. But I think given all that, Syrskyi was making quite a bit of progress in terms of slowing down the Russian offensive. Based on everything I know, and I follow the war on the ground quite carefully, I would not have fired Syrskyi. And I do not have any evidence that his replacement is going to be an improvement over Syrskyi. So what I would say to you is that firing Syrskyi doesn't make sense, but firing Syrskyi and the defense minister at the same time in the middle of a war where you're barely hanging on is not going to make things better unless you can tell me a story about finding a magical general who can come in and win the war. And nobody's telling that story. So I think it's really kind of on the Ukrainian side where the replacement of a general and the defense minister does not bode well for what's going on. Now, I want to make one other point. One of the arguments that's made, getting back to the casualty issue, is that the Russians engage in frontal attacks and their commanding generals don't care about life, the life of their soldiers, and they're willing to expend huge numbers of soldiers to achieve small gains. I actually don't think that's true at all. And I think if you look carefully at how the Russians have been employing their troops, they are actually remarkably cautious. They're not launching frontal attacks. They're actually trying to minimize casualties. And Putin himself has made this point clear. And this is one of the reasons I have real doubts about these claims in the West about these massive casualty levels for the Russian side. In contrast, I would note, if you read the articles about General Syrski, he was referred to by many of the troops as the Butcher. And he was called the Butcher because he was willing to expend lives quite liberally to stop the Russians as best he could. And as I said, I think he did an actually quite good job at that. But nevertheless, he was known as the Butcher. And I've never heard anybody on the Russian side being described as the Butcher. And this gets back to the casualty issue. If General Syrski is known as the Butcher and there's no equivalent Butcher on the other side, doesn't that tell you all these stories about the incredibly high casualty rates on the Russian side don't make a lot of sense?
That's a great point. That's a great point. Last question here on this topic at the strategic level. Here in, I think it was August the 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, there were two separate reports that came out on the same day. One is that Zelensky had said, hey, I want this war to be wrapped up by the end of the year, by Christmas. And I'm going to do it by putting enough pressure on Putin and doing some more things with more of these long-range strikes and sanctions from the European Union to finally bring him to the point to where he has to negotiate on terms we can live with. That's what one report said. Then a separate report said that Zelensky had floated the idea of basically a ceasefire, both an air and a ground ceasefire, freeze it on the line of contact, have negotiations there, freeze the air attacks so nobody's hitting each other's energy infrastructure, et cetera. Those seem to be in contradiction to one another. What do you make of these reports?
Well, I think that you get a similar pattern of behavior on the American side regarding the Iran war. If you listen to Trump talk, he some days is very optimistic about our prospects of winning the war. Other days, he and his advisors are very pessimistic. They're just sort of all over the place, and it's very hard to make sense of exactly what's going on. And I think the same thing is true with regard to the Ukrainians. There's no question that, number one, the Ukrainians have to spin a positive message to keep their own troops fighting. You remember, only about 25% of the Ukrainian population wants to continue this war. This war is no longer popular in Ukraine. Roughly 1/4 of the people want to continue the fight. The rest want to settle it. So Zelensky has to spin a positive story to keep his population on board, and also to continue to get success from the West, to convince the West that Ukraine is worth betting on. And he's especially concerned with keeping the United States in the fight. So you get this positive story for those reasons. But then point number two is, Zelensky is surely aware of what you and I have talked about many times, which is that Ukraine is not doing well on the battlefield, and it can't do very much with its long-range drone campaign, and that the longer this war goes on under the present circumstances, they surely understand that. They surely understand that every month they lose more territory. And they surely understand that the Russians become more aggressive in the air campaign as every month goes on. So I think in a very important way, he has an incentive to settle this one before the situation gets worse. I would bet a lot of money he understands that. And that explains the other narrative that comes from Zelensky and his aides. So you get these two sort of dueling narratives. And for people like us on the outside trying to make sense of what's going on, it's really very difficult. And I'm sure when we start talking about the war in Iran, there again, we'll have difficulty trying to make sense of exactly what's going on, because you have these dueling narratives and we don't have access to what's going on behind closed doors, which is what really matters, of course.
It does. And in fact, last one more question on this topic before we shift, because it relates directly to what you're talking about with dueling narratives. And I wonder if you can just give me your best estimate for what in the hell is going on in the State Department when on June the 3rd, Secretary of State Marco Rubio goes before the Senate under testimony or under oath and says, we picked a side in this war. We picked Ukraine. We didn't pick Russia. We're not neutral mediators. We're trying to help them win the war. And then on around August the 3rd, so almost exactly 2 months later, he says, you know what? We're just trying to end this war. President Trump knows Zelensky, he knows Putin, and we're just trying to see if is there any way that we can maybe, because of these long-range strikes, find some new evidence to bring the war to a conclusion. I mean, those are mutually exclusive messages, barely 60 days apart. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate for President Trump, Secretary of State, to be making contradictory arguments on a frequent
Very
basis.
consistent, I guess, right?
I mean, he is Trump's right-hand man for foreign policy, and therefore you would expect him to reflect the views of the president. And I think what's going on here is that Marco Rubio is reflecting President Trump's views.
But what is that? What is the rest of the world to think about this? What is Europe to think about this? What is Russia to think about this? When it's like, what, it depends on what day of the week we're talking about, what the American position even is. How does that affect our ability to either bring this war to a conclusion, the one in the Middle East, or really any kind of negotiations around the world?
I think that foreign leaders come to two conclusions. One is you can't trust us. I think this is where the Russians are at, and it's where the Iranians are at, and for good reason. By the way, it's where the Europeans are at as well. You just can't trust the United States. But second, and more importantly, I think that most leaders around the world think we are dangerous, that we could end up blowing up the world. I don't think that's likely for 1 second, but it is possible that we could end up causing a major war beyond the two wars that are going on now, because I don't think we really know what we're doing. And
that's a pretty big understatement.
No, the fact you can say that that's an understatement speaks volumes about where we're at, if you really think about it. But I don't think the administration knows what it's doing with regard to Iran. And even in the case of Ukraine, if you go back to what Trump said he was going to do in terms of settling that war, and then what happened at Anchorage, and then you fast forward to where we are today, he's been all over the map. And he has certainly failed to shut down this war, despite the fact that he was deeply committed to doing that. And in fact, Danny, he has not even come close to shutting down this war. And again, I think this just says a great deal about his ability to execute foreign policy. I mean, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but as you and I both know, if you're the president of the United States and you're trying to formulate and execute a coherent foreign policy, that has to be done in a very systematic or very rational legal way. You have to staff the problems that you face. You have to talk to all sorts of smart people who are with you or who are against you, so that you make sure that you understand exactly what you're up against. And then you want to make sure you dot every I and dot every T before you actually start a war, or you start on a path to end a war. You just have to act that way. Presidents in the past have acted that way, whether it was Joe Biden or Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton. We could just go back in time. They all had an apparatus in their